What's your family's dark secret? Edit 2 stories. The first one is kind of bland, but the second is definitely more extreme. I found out my uncle is actually my cousin. My aunt got pregnant at 15, so my grandma raised him as her own. Also, the more extreme one. Apparently my great-great, lots more greats, uncle was captured by Native Americans. So in order to escape, he managed to get his hands on one of their babies and threw it in a fire as a distraction.
The first story is pretty wild in its own way. Family dynamics can get complicated. Growing up thinking someone is an uncle only to find out he's a cousin is just a lot. The second story is even darker. It's hard to picture someone doing that just to escape. History has some brutal tales, and this one definitely fits the bill. Sometimes the past is just really messed up.
My great-grandma didn't approve of her daughter's boyfriend, so she invited him over for supper and regaled him with stories of family members who'd succumbed to mental illness and how she thought my great-aunt took after them. When that didn't work, she had my great-aunt committed to the state mental institution. We never found out exactly what was done to her there, but when she was released, she was no longer able to function on her own and was dependent on great-grandma until she died in her 30s.
That's pretty heavy. It's crazy how family dynamics can affect someone's life so much. Great-grandma went to extreme lengths to control the situation, but it ended up backfiring really badly. Sounds like a lot of unresolved issues there. It's sad to think about how that kind of treatment can change someone forever. I guess control can lead to darker outcomes than we expect.
I got pregnant at 23, and my family made me keep the pregnancy a secret because it was disgraceful because I wasn't married. I ended up having a miscarriage, but my family felt it was stupid for me to grieve and has swept it under the rug. Years ago, my cousin's girlfriend had a miscarriage, and I hated seeing my mom cry over it. It made me angry because I wasn't allowed to grieve, yet she was grieving over someone not even related to us.
It's tough how families can handle things differently. Your experience shows how double standards can really affect emotions. You were dealing with your own loss, yet the response from your family didn't acknowledge that. Seeing your mom react to someone else's pain while dismissing yours must have felt really unfair. It's important to have space to grieve regardless of the situation. Everyone deserves to process their feelings.
More than likely, Ted Bundy is my grandfather's half-brother. My grandfather's dad gave women aliases always starting with J and his real last name Worthington. Where my great-grandfather John Worthington worked in Philly is where Ted's mother claimed to have met Jack Worthington. Of my grandfather's 7 known siblings, we are still finding half-siblings of his. Only 3 have never been committed or imprisoned. Maybe crazy runs in the family?
That's an interesting family history. It must be wild to find out connections like that. Discovering relatives with such a notorious past would definitely make someone think about the patterns in families. It's intriguing how sometimes families have secrets and surprising stories. I guess every family has its own unique tale, whether it's light or dark.
My grandfather was an illegal immigrant. He was born in Czechoslovakia to a Jewish mother and Catholic father and lived in Prague. When Germany took over Czechoslovakia in 1939, my grandfather got Catholic papers and joined the Hitler Youth. When he was old enough, he became a merchant seaman. In June of 41 or 42, I forget, he was unloading cargo in New York and fled. Family friends hid him for a while, and he surfaced with a whole new identity.
That's a unique story. It's interesting how he navigated such a complicated situation. Living under a different identity must have been tough for him. It's a real testament to survival and adapting to change. I can't imagine the kind of pressure he faced at that time. It really shows how history can shape one's life in unexpected ways. Makes you think about the lengths people go to for safety.
Brother is only a half-brother. Before my dad was with my mom, he was with my aunt, her sister. Had a kid with her, my older brother, then decided he was done with her and left her for my mom, her sister. To get technical, he's my half-brother, half-cousin, full cousin. Fun times with me and my bro Sin. Edit. Fixed a thing, second edit. To those asking about family gatherings, I don't bother with a lot of them. So I don't honestly know.
That's an interesting family setup. It must be a bit confusing sometimes, but I can see how it creates a unique bond. I guess you just learn to roll with it and have a good relationship with him regardless of the labels. Family dynamics can get complicated, but it's cool you have a connection with your bro Sin. Sometimes it's all about the vibe, not the titles.
My granddad made hundreds of millions through his business and investments by the time he died. Most of it, though, only happened a few years before he passed. He never got on well with the rest of the family apart from my parents. As a result, he left everything to charity in his will. Of course, the family weren't happy about this and wanted to get rich from his hard work, so they lawyered up and fought for years to get the money. Unfortunately, they eventually won. Not all of it, but most, taking millions from needy charities and spending it on houses, cars, holidays, and gambling. Lots and lots of gambling. Needless to say, we don't talk to that part of the family.
That's a wild situation. It's interesting how things can change so quickly with money involved. Your granddad had a clear vision, but once he passed, it all turned into chaos. It's unfortunate that the focus shifted from helping others to personal gain. I can see why you'd want to distance yourself from that part of the family. Money can really bring out the worst in people.
Supposedly, my family picked the wrong side in the French Revolution and sided with the French royalty and had to flee to England after some of them lost their heads. Money buys favor, and they were given land in Scotland by the crown. All was well and good till they ticked off the church, and after some of them lost their heads and had to flee to Canada. Now we wait to tick off the Canadian government and see who loses their heads and where we have to go next. My grandfather has a French family crest and an English coat of arms tabards that no one wants to talk about. I only found out about them after helping him move after my grandmother died.
That's an interesting family history. Seems like your ancestors were always in the thick of things. Fleeing from the French Revolution, then running from the church, and now potentially the Canadian government. Those coats of arms sound pretty significant, especially if no one wants to discuss them. It's wild how these stories come out when helping family. Makes you wonder what other secrets might be hiding out there.
My great-uncle got into a fight with a man who broke a beer bottle over the side of his head and damaged his ear. A while later, my G-uncle and G-grandpa walked into a little country store where the bottle wielding guy just happened to be. My G-uncle shot him in cold blood. Uncle went to trial, and it was a hung jury. Uncle went to trial again later with a not guilty verdict. G-grandpa paid off the jury. Twice.
That's a pretty wild story. Your great-uncle really took matters into his own hands. It's interesting how things turned out with the jury. Sounds like there was a lot going on behind the scenes. Not everyone gets a second chance at a trial like that, and the whole situation in a small town must have been tense. Just goes to show how messy family histories can get.
My great-grandfather was in the Black Hand in New York during the 1920s. He was a low-level guy, basically shaking down local businesses for protection money. Anyway, he eventually gets caught, dragged in, and booted back to Sicily, leaving my great-grandmother and her children, my grandfather included, penniless. Later it turns out that he has another family back in Naples, who come and visit 40 years later. They're a shady bunch, so my grandfather and his siblings didn't want anything to do with them. His brothers and sisters grew up to be respectable shit, like firemen and police officers, while he grew up to design fuels for ICBMs in the 50s and 60s, which is another whole strange story.
That is a wild family story. Your great-grandfather's life seems like a movie plot. It's interesting how things can split a family apart like that. It's good to see your grandfather and his siblings turn out well despite the chaos. Designing fuels for ICBMs is quite a shift from dealing with mobs. Makes you think about how past choices shape future paths.
My dad sorta kidnapped me and my brother. My parents were getting divorced. I guess my dad's lawyer advised my dad that my mom could take me and my brother away and would probably win sole custody if she got across state lines. So my dad took my brother and I to a hotel, cried in the bathroom, told us about the divorce, and then dropped us off with a family friend. I remember all of this to a pretty strange degree, given I was 6. My mom gets home, no kids, asks my dad where we are. He won't tell her. I guess the police were called because that's terrifying. Meanwhile, I was at my dad's friend's house drawing pictures and eating cookies. My parents eventually got joint custody, and I didn't even know about how fucked up this got until I was an adult. Because in my head, it had always been I spent a cool weekend at my dad's friend's house, until for some reason my dad decides to fess up. Still not sure how I feel about that. Also still not sure if my mom ever found out where we were that weekend. Bonus one. My aunt may or may not be wanted in Alaska for fraud.
That sounds pretty wild. I mean, being taken to a hotel at 6 and ending up at a family friend's place without really knowing what's going on. Kids just roll with it sometimes. It must be strange to look back and realize it wasn't just a fun weekend. The whole custody thing can complicate memories too. And your aunt being potentially wanted adds another layer. Family dynamics can be really complex.
One of my cousins up and left after he stole a lot of money from the safe of the family business. Only my grandmother and myself know that he moved to the UK, where he works as a mechanic or something. How he moved there we don't know, but he regularly calls my grandmother to talk to her. Even sent some money back.
It's interesting how some family members can surprise you. Your cousin's decision to leave must have changed a lot in the family dynamic. It's good to hear he still checks in with your grandmother and even sends money back. Life takes unexpected turns, doesn't it? Sometimes you just have to accept those changes and learn to cope with them.
My late uncle was 18 years younger than my mom. Their mother, my grandma, had been in an asylum while she was pregnant with him, so a lot of friends and family members didn't even know she was pregnant until she had the baby. This, combined with the huge age gap between the kids, led many people to believe that he was actually my mom's kid and that her mom faked being pregnant with him to cover it up. There was no truth to this at all, but the rumor persisted for a while.
That's an interesting family dynamic. It's wild how rumors can start, especially with something as unusual as that. I can see why people would jump to conclusions with the age gap and the circumstances. Family stories like this can really shape how people view the past. It must have been tough for your uncle having to deal with those misconceptions. Pretty heavy stuff for a family, really.
Granddad was a professional murderer for the Brits. It got my family out of the old country after World War II, but it estranged our branch from the whole family for 80 years and counting. He turned out really awful, abusive, drunk, and shit father. But he is the reason we live in here now, and didn't spend 3 generations under the Soviets. He died the same month I was born, so I never met him, but I've spent 5 years compiling family stories and writing a book about our weird folks.
That's a pretty wild family history. It's interesting how the actions of one person can change the course for so many. Sounds like you've put in a lot of effort to dig into those stories. It must be tough knowing your granddad was so complicated, but at least you can learn from that. Working on a book about it seems like a good way to connect with that side of your family.
My stepfather is a good old boy from Texas who came from a mysterious family background. He married my mom when I was 4 years old and essentially raised me like I was his own. My mom is Filipino and my birth father is Scottish and Native American, Lumbee. So when you see me, you can tell I'm clearly a mixed lady. Years down the road, when I was a teenager and visiting my stepfather's family in Texas, it was let out that his father was not only a prominent judge back in 1960s, but also a grand wizard of the KKK. You can imagine the awkwardness that filled the air as I sat there, quickly wondering if his family judged him for raising me, a half-breed kid.
That's a heavy family history. It's wild to think how people's past can shape the present. Your stepdad sounds like a good dude for taking you in and raising you right. It's surprising how these things come to light, especially during family visits. Must have been awkward figuring out where everyone stands on things. It's tough navigating such legacies, especially when they contrast with your own identity.
My family goes around telling everyone that I'm darker than my brothers because I tan easier, but that's not the case at all. One night my dad got really drunk and rambled to me about how he slept with a Dominican girl when they were separated and she turned up pregnant. She bled to death during childbirth, and that's how I'm here. Just one more odd thing to add to the list. Only girl of 5 siblings, youngest child, fairly normal name compared to the laughable ones my brothers are stuck with, and half Dominican. Embrace being unique, guys.
That's a pretty wild family story. It's interesting how our backgrounds shape who we are. Being the youngest and the only girl in a group of brothers adds another layer. Sounds like you've got a lot on your plate with those family dynamics. But at least you can appreciate your unique identity. Embracing that can be empowering, for sure. Just being yourself is what really matters in the end.
Dad's side, babies being conceived and born out of wedlock, like it was going out of fashion, including me, technically. There's also the case of a missing small family fortune. Mom's side, we were Mennonite. One of my super great-grandfathers was a famous Mennonite bishop. One of my great-grandmothers did something to get her ass shunned, so now we're not Mennonite anymore. One of my great-uncles apparently liked to cross-dress. A lot. We're also direct descendants of the Leeds family, therefore making the Jersey Devil something along the lines of my 10th great-uncle. That explains a lot, actually.
That's quite the family history. Sounds like you've got a mix of interesting stories on both sides. The babies out of wedlock thing must have its own quirks. And losing that small fortune adds a layer too. The Mennonite background is intriguing, especially with the bishop connection. Losing that status and having a great uncle who liked to cross-dress makes it even more unique. The Jersey Devil link is wild. It all paints a vivid picture.
I guess you might say that I am my family's dark secret. Long story short, as soon as my dad found out my mom was pregnant, he skipped town, left everything behind, and disappeared. No one had any idea where he had gone. It took my mom until I was 11 years old to find him. Imagine everyone's surprise when my mother shows up at his doorstep and demands that he take a paternity test in front of his wife and 3 children. It seems Dear Daddy never told his other family that he knocked up another woman prior to meeting the wife. They divorced soon after that.
That's quite a story. Family secrets can really complicate things. Your mom showing up like that must have created a lot of tension. It's wild to think about how some people can keep things hidden for years. It probably changed your life and his other families too. Can't imagine how his wife reacted. Sometimes, the truth just crashes into everything, and there's no way to prepare for it.
My grandmother is actually my aunt and vice versa. Being both from England, when they discovered my aunt was pregnant, they hid it and said my grandmother, who was the elder of the two, was the mother. It was apparently less of a social stigma that way. I don't care. Both are wonderful people who I love. Edit. I guess aunt is the wrong term. Whatever my grandmother's sister would be to me. Great aunt.
That's a unique family situation. It's interesting how some stories go deeper than the surface. Labels can be confusing too, especially with family. What matters is the bond you share. They both sound like solid people, which is what really counts in the end. No need to stress too much over titles, right? Family is family, no matter what you call them.
My grandpa was a big dude, roughly 6 feet 6 inches, 300 pounds. He was a very close friend, confidant, and bodyguard for Jimmy Hoffa. For many reasons, my grandma finally was able to convince force my grandpa to leave the Teamsters, the lifestyle, and move to northern Michigan. It's not really a secret at all in my family, but rather something that no one really talks about. Everyone knows Grandpa was very close with Hoffa. There just isn't a lot of details. Edit grammar.
Sounds like your grandpa had quite the life. Being so close to someone like Hoffa must have led to some interesting stories. It's funny how families have their own secrets, or just choose not to discuss them. Moving to northern Michigan must have been a big change for him. I guess some things are better left unsaid, huh?
In the 80s, my grandmother was short on money, so my uncle burned one of her rentals down. Thankfully, the tenant got out in time. My grandmother took the arson hit, and my uncle was never sure why until she died, and he found out she felt guilty for never telling him he was a love child from an affair.
That's a wild story. Family secrets can really twist things. Your uncle probably thought he was just doing what he needed for some cash, but it was way deeper than that. It's interesting how guilt can drive people to make strange choices. Your grandmother made a tough sacrifice without showing any signs. Just goes to show how complicated family dynamics can get. It makes you think about the hidden stories behind what we know.
Alcoholism runs through my dad's genes. His dad died of liver failure before I was born. His older sister basically killed herself while drunk driving. His younger sister isn't far behind the older sister and wouldn't be surprised if she has an alcohol-related death. My dad is a reformed alcoholic. He substituted alcohol for food. My bro is a functioning alcoholic, and I have no idea about myself. I know I have a very high tolerance for the stuff, but have self-control to limit my intake except when around family. They bring out the worst in me.
That sounds tough. Family dynamics can be complicated, especially with something like that in the background. It's interesting how habits and struggles can get passed down. It's good to hear your dad managed to turn things around, but it must be challenging for you when you're around them. Everyone reacts differently, and knowing your limits is a solid start. Just taking it one step at a time can help.
My grandfather's uncle was a sergeant of the Peruvian army and follower of Velasco, a Peruvian dictator from the 70s. When Velasco died, he barricaded himself in a military school along with his subordinates. He surrendered at the end, but kept serving the country, serving a new president. Disclaimer, my grandfather told me this some time ago. That's why the details are fuzzy, see?
That's an interesting family story. It's always wild to think about how personal histories intersect with larger events. People can be really loyal, even when the times change. Your grandfather's uncle seems like he had a complicated relationship with authority. It's kind of intriguing how he went from following one leader to serving another, though I can see why those details might get a bit fuzzy over time.
We don't know the secret yet. My mom's dad, my grandfather, is a mystery person. My mom never met her dad, and when my mom was 13, her mom was killed in a car accident. According to some distant family members, they know who her father is, but cannot tell her until someone has died. I don't know why she's not allowed to know until someone dies, and I don't know why.
That's a pretty heavy situation. It must be tough for your mom not knowing her dad or the truth behind it all. The whole waiting for someone to die part adds an unsettling layer. I can't imagine what kind of feelings that brings up for her. It's just strange how families can have these secrets and rules. I hope she finds out more when the time is right.
The only reason I'm alive is that my mom and dad both had a cocaine habit and met at a party where there was cocaine in the late 80s. They got together, and a couple years later I was born. It's really not that bad because they got sober when my mom found out she was pregnant. There wasn't any complications with my birth, and I have a good relationship with both of them. But it's kind of fucked up to learn in your 20s that hard drugs are the reason you're alive.
That's an interesting story. It's wild how life works out sometimes. Your parents turned their lives around, which is good. Finding out about your origins must have been a lot to take in. It shows how complex family histories can be. But it sounds like you have a decent relationship with them now, which is what really matters.
When I was 17, my mom tearfully told me that her former husband was not my biological father. Instead of the alcoholic pool shark that genuinely believed his own lies, my father was a guy that went off to college to become a high school shop teacher. Instead of being upset like my mom, I was elated. My whole life, my grandfather would never speak with his only brother. It was because he thought he cheated with my grandmother. This year, now that my grandma is 89, she told my mom, her caretaker, that her real father was that uncle. So my mother and I both have different fathers than we thought.
That's a wild story. Finding out about family secrets can change your whole perspective. It's interesting how these revelations can bring relief to some, like you, instead of anger. It must have been a lot to process for both you and your mom. The layers of family dynamics make life pretty complicated, but it seems like it gave you both a chance to learn more about your roots.
My father's father had a second family back in the mid-40s, and as a result, my dad has a half-brother and sister. But he never told me about them, never talks about them, and I only know because my grandmother, long dead now, told me and my mother confirmed it. Apparently, my grandfather was an arse. He was a drunk, a gambler, and he left my gran for this other woman. He moved them across the country, to Perth, WA, Australia. But when he got sick with cancer, my gran went to Cockatoo Island to nurse him until he died. No idea what happened to the other woman or the kids. I've never found them, or known anything about them other than I presume they exist. Sad thing is, I come from a very small family, no aunts/uncles/cousins, and would have loved to have more family growing up. But I respect my dad too much to do anything while he is alive. I'm not going to look into it until he goes. He's 84 now.
That's a pretty heavy story. Family secrets can really complicate things. It's tough knowing there's a part of your family out there you can't connect with. It's understandable you'd want to respect your dad's feelings. The whole situation about your grandfather is frustrating, and it makes you wonder about what kind of family ties are lost over time. It's nice that you have that consideration for your dad, though.
1. One of my mom's cousins was brutally murdered by her abusive ex-boyfriend when my mom was 16 too. My great-aunt grandmother's sister had a baby and gave it up for adoption. Most of the family only found out about it a few years ago when we reconnected with him. He's doing well, happily married with 3 daughters.
That's some heavy stuff. It's wild how family stories can unfold like that. Learning about someone you didn't know existed and seeing they're doing well must have been a mix of emotions. Life has a way of surprising us, even with the tough parts. It's good to hear he's found happiness, especially after everything. Families can be complicated, but they also bring unexpected connections.
I had relatives living in the DDR/GDR. One of them apparently had a giant house, had one of the few telephones in his area, and organized for my uncle to visit him several times without being checked at the border. He disappeared just days after the Stasi headquarters in Berlin were stormed and was never seen again.
That sounds like a heavy story. Having relatives in the DDR had to be different, especially with all the restrictions. It's crazy to think about how some people could have that much influence, like having a big house and a phone. The fact that he vanished after such a pivotal moment really adds to the mystery. It must have left a lasting impact on your family.
Direct descendants of a very despised famous person. How to change the family name. Edit, John Wilkes Booth. He himself never had kids, but were descended from his sister Asia. It's always been something we've been told not to disclose, and my grandparents and mom are still very secretive about it, but I really don't mind people knowing. It was so damn long ago. Asia loved John dearly, even after he killed Lincoln, and she held on to a lot of his belongings that are still in the family today, some of which were passed down directly to me.
It's interesting to have a connection to such a controversial figure. Your family's story seems to be filled with complexity and a bit of secrecy. The fact that you have some of his belongings could hold a lot of historical significance. It makes sense that your family would want to distance itself from that legacy, but also fascinating that you don't mind. It's like carrying a piece of history that's both a burden and a story to tell.
Not really a dark secret, but still fucked up. My grandmother was about to be married, and on her wedding day, her soon-to-be brother-in-law showed up at her house. He was supposed to come pick her up to take her to the church, but instead he informed her that her fiancé had dropped dead as he was dressing for the wedding.
That's a pretty wild story. Imagine getting ready for what should be the happiest day, and then hearing something like that. It must have been a shock for her and the family. Things like that can really change everything in an instant. Just goes to show how unpredictable life can be. You think everything's set, and then bam, it all falls apart.
My one cousin, as a child, would start fires. It led to him burning down their house when he was like 7 or 8. He went away to a special child psych hospital where he stayed until he was 18. At 18, they simply unloaded my cousin back into society, hoping for the best. It's been a few years since his release. So far, he hasn't burned down any more houses.
That's certainly something. Sounds like your cousin went through a tough time. It's good to hear he hasn't gotten into any more trouble since then. Hopefully, he's found better ways to deal with whatever was going on. I can only imagine how his family felt during that whole situation. Sometimes, life takes unexpected turns. Let's see how he handles things moving forward.
My Gigi grandmother was Chinese. It's not a dark secret in my immediate family. It comes in handy if I'm ever playing 2 truths and a lie, because I'm white as hell, but I'm pretty sure my grandpa doesn't advertise it. He once called Obama a half-breed. I don't think he'd be pumped to have everyone know he's a quarter Asian.
It's interesting how family backgrounds can shape perceptions. Your Gigi grandmother's heritage adds a layer to your identity. It's kind of funny how some relatives might not embrace that part of their history, especially with the way opinions can shift. People often hold on to outdated views while being connected to diverse backgrounds themselves. It's a reminder that everyone has layers, you know?
If you are from Virginia, it is possible her race was wrong on official documents. There were several decades where the race of blacks and natives were identified incorrectly, especially after the Civil War. It is likely other southern states had similar issues. Also, if she was from Appalachia, mountains of VA, NC, TN, or a WV, she could be Melungeon. Have you had a DNA test done? It could clear up a lot of questions in your family.
I think it's interesting how official documents can mess up someone's history. My friend had issues like that too, where categorizing people wasn't accurate. It just shows how complicated identity can be. She did take a DNA test eventually, and it helped answer some questions about her ancestry. It's pretty cool how science can give clarity, even when historical records are all mixed up.
Please consider subscribing if you enjoyed. Love.